Super. Thank you very much, Becca, and welcome to everyone who has joined us this morning. This is the California Fire Safe Council 21 SFA application webinar. And again, thank you for joining us. This application webinar will be presented by myself. My name is Thomas Schumacher. I'm a staff grant specialist here with CFSC. And also it will be presented by my colleague, Becca Joyner, who's also a staff grant specialist here with the CFSC. Next slide, please. Okay, right now we're going to go over the agenda just to give you an idea of the kind of material we're going to cover today. We're going to cover the grant program overview, federal grants basics, the grant life cycle phases, writing and application, submittal requirements, and the selection and award process. But before we do that, my colleague Becca has a poll question and some icebreakers for everyone. So at this point, I will turn the floor back over to Becca for this slide, the next slide.
Thank you, Thomas. All right, I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll now. If everyone can take a moment to answer those questions. There are 4 questions that we have for you all today. We just want to know if we have any current or past CFFC grantees before. So have you ever received a grant through CFFC? Our second question is, what type of organization are you with? Our third question, have you ever managed a federally funded grant before? And then our icebreaker question, what is your preferred morning beverage? I have not touched my cup of coffee yet this morning, but it is here. So I do have it and would love to know what you all have as well. And also during this time, just a quick reminder, if during the presentation, you can please stay muted with your camera off. There will be many links that we will talk about during our presentation. Those will be dropped into the chat by Nina Evans, one of our Climate AmeriCorps, Climate Action Corps AmeriCorps fellows. And we have Ellie O'Neill, another Climate Action Corps fellow that's doing our slides today. So huge thank you to them. If you can please put your questions either into the chat or we can address them at the end of the presentation. But you are definitely able to input those into the chat as well. Let me see. That is I already got a question about whether Listos is federally funded. That's a great question. I'm going to go ahead and say no, I don't believe so, but I'll have to double check on that one. And then just as an FYI, this presentation is being recorded and we will be providing, so those questions, if you're putting them in the chat's actually really useful because then we're going to put all of the questions together from all of the presentations and we'll be sending them out after our final presentation, which is on May 14th. So probably that following week, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording as well as a list of FAQs. And then if you are receiving a Listos grant through CFFC, then yes, you would say that you're a CFFC grantee previously. But thank you, Mala, for jumping in on the chat there. Listos is state funded. That's what I thought. So, okay. All right. And with all of my blab, and hopefully everyone had enough time to do the poll, I'll give everyone just a few more seconds on that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling. All right, and let's see those results. Okay, so about 69% of folks in attendance have not received a CFFC grant before. So welcome, we're so glad to have you all here today. And then for our types of organizations, okay, we have a 38% of fire safe councils at our training yesterday. We had a lot of others, so some more fire safe councils today, as well as some fire safe alliances, an HOA, or POA, as well as some fire department and others. For those other folks, if you would like to send me a direct message or email, just let me know what kind of organization you're with. That would be awesome. About half and half in regards to federally funded grants. And then the real important question, what is our morning beverage preference? And we got a strong winner here with coffee at 69%. But then a close, I was going to say a close second, then I realized it was 23% with tea. But so awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. I will go ahead and stop sharing the results and hand it back over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Becca. And I'm a hardcore tea drinker, so I'll throw my weight in. Maybe that'll bring it up to 25% if I'm lucky. All right, if we could move to the acknowledgement slide, please. Thank you very much. First of all, this grant program and publications are funded in full by the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Region under the terms of grant number 2Z-DG 11052012-135. The opinions expressed are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Forest Service. Next slide, please. Okay, what we're dealing with in today's webinar, the primary focus is federal grant funds and how they are managed, allocated, and controlled. A successful grant application is more than just a good project proposal. Federal grants are subject to the applicable federal rules and regulations, especially to CFR 200 and the terms and conditions of the program. This workshop is to assist you in how to write a competitive grant application while also addressing all the rules and eligibility requirements of the grant program itself. CFSC wants you to be prepared before submitting the application to receive and manage a federal grant. CFSC federal grants are not free money. And remember, you are not under obligation to accept it. You can if you wish, if you are awarded one, but you are not required to. Next slide, please. The Grants Clearinghouse. The California Fire Alliance originally assisted the California Fire Safe Council in the creation of the clearinghouse itself to help achieve the goals of the National Fire Plan by facilitating an open, collaborative process for grant funding. Operated by the CFSC, the Grants Clearinghouse is an online grant application process, and we have a web address at www.cafiresafecouncil.org. You'll see that web address in this particular slide toward the top of the page. At this website, applicants can sign up for a username and password, complete a grant application, and submit it to the clearinghouse for consideration for funding. Agencies that have traditionally funded the CFSC Grants Clearinghouse include the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as State Farm Insurance. Next slide, please. We have a number of important resources that we want to bring to your attention right away. On the CFSC website, you can find resources such as the application handbook, the request for applications, and an application planning tool. Once again, that's all at the link that you will see in blue print toward the middle of the page, www.cafiresafecouncil.org. Also, we'd like to direct your attention toward Zoom Grants. Zoom Grants is the online platform through which you will be submitting and managing your application. You can find this through www.cafiresafecouncil.org/Zoom Grants login, or directly through the Zoom Grants website, www.zoomgrants.com. Both of those are listed on the slide for you. Next slide, please. The California Fire Safe Council Grants Clearinghouse is here to help. On this slide, you will see the names and contact information, not only of our organizational executive director, Hedy Jalon, but also all of the members of our grant specialist team. This includes our manager, Amber Gardner, and all of the staff, Dan Lang, Dave Farley, my colleague, Becca Joyner, myself, and Laurent Galliano. Next slide, please. But there's more. We also have a fantastic programs and outreach team that helps support the work of the California Fire Safe Council and the grants team as well. Currently, this is staffed by Elizabeth Lamar and Mala Arthur. Their contact information is listed on this slide. We also have additional support provided by Delana Scott, our IT and Data Administrations Manager and resident expert. We recommend that you contact any or all of these people for questions you might have. At this point, I would like to turn the floor over to my colleague, Mala Arthur, from the Programs and Outreach team for a brief word about the great work that they do. Mala began working for the California Fire Safe Council as the Southern California Regional Coordinator in November of 2020. She has used her personal experience running a fire safe council to help other fire safe councils with grant requirements, finding fiscal sponsors, deciding which projects are possible and which should have priority, and finding mentors. At this point, Mala, I turn the floor over to you for your use.
Thanks, Thomas. It's a pleasure to be here. The Programs and Outreach team was created to support and communicate with our grantees and with other fire mitigation organizations in California, including but not limited to fire safe councils. Our overarching goal is to help community-based organizations like yours to prepare the people of California for wildfire and hopefully to keep more people safe along with their families, pets, and homes. We celebrate and support your efforts to inform and to help your community. We have many resources that we can offer, which are available for all fire mitigation organizations in California. Several AmeriCorps Climate Action Corps fellows are completing projects that enhance our ability to help you. They recently sent out a survey, which hopefully you all have received and hopefully you can complete by Friday. They also are working on an improved map of all of the fire mitigation organizations that we know of in California. This will hopefully include maps of the boundaries for each organization. Once that project is completed, we can reach out to offer resources and assistance in preparing their communities. Parts of the map will be available to everyone to help you and other organizations find other organizations to work with or mentor. We'd love to be in touch with you regardless of whether you are awarded one of our grants. We want you to succeed. Feel free to contact either myself or Elizabeth. Thank you for your time, and now back to Thomas.
Thank you very much, Mala. I really appreciate that. Next slide, please. Wonderful. Some important dates that I'd like to bring to your attention right away. The 2021 cycle opens with a call for applications on May 3rd, 2021, just yesterday. Also, we have grant application training workshops online through a Zoom-based format this year, such as the one you're attending right now. Those run from May 3rd all the way through May 14th. Applications are due online at June 15th, 2021 at midnight. The preliminary award announcements will be made in August of 2021, so just a few months down the line. Remember, you must complete all required sections of the online application in order for your application to be considered for funding. You must also upload the required letters of commitment, the fiscal sponsor agreement, and federal negotiated indirect cost rate, if you are using one, to complete your application. Make sure that the letters of commitment and fiscal sponsor agreements meet the required explanations and details that we'll explain in later slides and in the appendices to follow. Inadequate or inaccurate applications, letters of commitment, and agreements may result in disqualification. We will get to more on this in later slides. Next slide, please. The available funding comes from the State Fire Assistance Grant Program. This year, we have $1.3 million at our disposal. Each grant carries with it a dollar-for-dollar match requirement. More on this later. We also have a $200,000 maximum on funding requests. Remember, the projects must be located in California or the Tahoe Basin region of Nevada. Next slide, please. The U.S. Forest Service State Fire Assistance Program is designed to help people and communities to moderate the threat of catastrophic fire. It aims to do this through several means, specifically community hazard mitigation and planning through prevention and mitigation education, as well as fuel hazard mitigation on non-federal land. A great deal of work can be done in these grants because, keep in mind, the grants run for a 24-month term total. We will get to examples of these different types of projects in just a few slides, so keep these categories in mind. Next slide, please. Another part of our program is the California's Forest and Rangelands Assessment 2017, Chapter 11, specifically reducing community wildfire risk. What does this mean? Funding requirements for state agencies include that federal funds will be used to implement actions that utilize community wildfire protection plan strategies. These are known as CWPPs. What we recommend is to check with your CAL FIRE or local government agency to see if a CWPP exists for your community already. The reason we say this is because many communities throughout the state have one in place already. Linking up with it would make your work easier and more efficient. Next slide, please. The SFA program, as I mentioned earlier, has a dollar-for-dollar match requirement. It can be cash or in kind. What does this mean? It means that 50% of project costs must come from the federal grant, in other words, federal funds, and the other 50% from match from your organization. For example, a $100,000 request must be matched by $100,000 from the applicant. As I mentioned earlier, there is a $200,000 maximum request limit. Each applicant is eligible to submit up to 2 applications, not more. Fiscal sponsors, however, may submit 2 applications and receive up to a maximum of $200,000 for its own organization. A fiscal sponsor may also provide sponsorship for up to 3 organizations for a funding total not to exceed $300,000. As an illustration, if a fiscal sponsor is identified by 3 organizations, each asking for $200,000, then only one of those applications could be funded. Alternatively, if a fiscal sponsor is identified by 3 organizations, each asking for $60,000, then all 3 applications could potentially be funded. Remember that all supplemental documents listed must be uploaded through Zoom grants. We don't accept fax, email, or standard mail. A project vicinity map showing the project's boundaries and including specific locations such as fuel breaks and fuel treatment areas, if more than one area is included, is also required. For projects with dispersed locations such as homeowners chipping or regional focus, such as those planning for education or the distribution of educational materials, show us a map that identifies where the specific information will be distributed. Next slide, please. Remember that just a few moments ago, I mentioned that we had a number of different types of project categories. This slide has 3 major categories that we'd like to suggest to you as ways to narrow down the focus of your application. The first major category is prevention education and outreach. This can include defensible space education, door-to-door community outreach, creating or disseminating outreach products such as pamphlets, posters, mailings, billboards, videos, and the like. Also, hosting educational workshops and training. The California Fire Safe Council wants you to remember that it's a good idea to include some funds in your budget for advertising as well as refreshments. Another major category is community hazard mitigation and planning projects. This can include developing a community wildfire protection plan or an equivalent plan that focuses on communities at risk and/or at-risk communities adjacent to federal land and incorporating federal projects. Conducting community risk or hazard assessments is also a component of this, including those needed for the FireWise Communities program. The last major category is fuel hazard mitigation projects. This one can include chipper programs that are community-wide and/or curbside-based. Also, community protection fuel break construction or vegetation thinning projects. prescribed burning, fuel reductions, delivering biomass to the markets, and the maintenance of previous fuel reduction projects. So as you can see, there is a wide variety of categories and subcategories. Next slide, please. By this point, you might be wondering who is eligible to apply for one of our grants. Happily, a broad range of organizations is eligible. All applicant organizations and fiscal sponsors should be aware of federal grant management requirements before applying. Organizations selected for funding must have written policies and procedures for managing their business processes and duties. These should include written policies for financial management and accounting, purchasing and procurement, personnel, if applicable, and conflict of interest. Eligible applicants should only seek funding for projects that they have the capacity to manage. A very important point, and more of this soon. But for right now, the screen in front of you will say what different organizations are eligible to apply. This includes nonprofits, HOAs and POAs, Native American tribes, resource conservation districts, towns and cities, institutions of higher learning, for-profit companies, special districts, school districts, counties, and even state agencies. Only individuals are not eligible to apply for our grants. Next slide, please. A very important consideration as you move forward with an application is the role and need for a fiscal sponsor. Some applicants recognize that their organizations do not possess the necessary organizational capacity to apply for and receive federal grant funds. These applicants should seek a fiscal sponsor with the proper financial and business management systems to receive the grant on their behalf. What's the role of a fiscal sponsor? The fiscal sponsor acts on behalf of an applicant organization that is not incorporated or does not have the organizational capacity to receive federal grant funds. The fiscal sponsor assumes legal responsibility for the management of your grant funds, including signing the subaward agreement, receiving the grant funds themselves, full accounting services, the preparation of reports, project management, bid solicitation and contracting, and the processing of invoices or work orders. Next slide, please. This slide will give you an idea of where you fit in the overall scheme of the process of grant funds coming from the federal government to you and then to the communities in the state. The funds originate in the federal government with authorization from the Congress and the President and perhaps a department or agency. That department or agency then passes those funds to a pass-through or recipient organization. The California Fire Safe Council is a pass-through organization of this kind. We then grant those funds out to applicant organizations or a fiscal sponsor if applicable. This is where you and your organization fit in. The beneficiary is the public, the specific groups that are supported by the grant activities in your community and throughout the state. Remember that federal grants are made available through appropriations of the federal government and therefore are subject to the management of federal funds as the federal government requires. Next slide, please. As the subrecipient, referencing back to the previous slide, your role in this is to accomplish the grant objectives, to implement the project as approved. This means working with contractors, vendors, and the like to make sure that the work is done. This also includes monitoring and tracking all accomplishments and progress and documenting this progress with before and after photos. Remember that the subrecipient is the organization that carries out the grant project. This work is carried on with funding through the pass-through entity. The subrecipient includes the applicant organization and the fiscal sponsor if that applies. Next slide, please. As you move forward with your grant, should you be awarded one, you will be required to ensure that there is proper grant management. This means that you follow all grant requirements, especially in reference to 2 CFR 200. Also, you must provide accurate, complete, and timely reports. You must meet all deadlines, and as CFSC will always recommend, document, document, document everything related to the grant, especially the expenses and the match. Remember, you must keep complete accounting records for 3 full years after the grant closes. Next slide, please. A very important consideration as you move forward applying for a grant is to ask yourself not only if you are eligible, but if you have the capacity to manage a federal grant. Capacity includes questions such as, does your financial management system meet federal requirements? Do you have the necessary project management and technical expertise, or can you get it? Have you successfully completed similar projects before in the past? Do you need a fiscal sponsor? And lastly, can you handle the added work? A very important consideration. When it comes to financial management considerations, ask yourself, does your organization have written policies and procedures that meet the federal requirements? Does your organization have adequate business management systems that comply with those? And does your organization have financial and accounting systems that ensure proper expenditure and accounting for the grant funds? Remember, that added workload piece is very important. Does your organization have the staff and/or volunteer time necessary to manage and complete the grant project? If you answered no to these questions, any of them, your organization will need to update its policies, procedures, and systems prior to receiving the grant funds. You will not be awarded a grant unless your organization can demonstrate adequate capacity to manage the grant funds and implement the project successfully. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, federal grant funds may only be used in accordance with the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically 2 CFR 200 and the Office of Management and Budget Policies. These regulations provide very detailed guidance on how you must manage your grant funds and the activities of your work. There are consequences for not complying with the federal regulations. This includes repayment of the grant funds and more. We'll get to more of this later on. We recommend strongly that you read the regulations that apply to your organization before you decide to apply for a grant. Next slide, please. A very important part of your work and the project is the presence of written policies. Federal grantees and subrecipients must have written policies that ensure proper handling of the funds. The policies demonstrate that the organization has internal control to protect, spend, and manage the grant funds accurately and in compliance with the grant requirements. When drafting or revising your written policies, refer to the federal grant regulations. These regulations will direct what stipulations need to be included in your policies. Keep in mind that the federal grant regulations may go well above and beyond your existing policies and procedures. If you would like to receive federal grant funds, then your policies must meet those standards. There are several major categories of written policies that you must include. These include property management, such as safeguarding equipment or how to acquire and dispose of property. Another category is travel, meaning the reimbursement or approval of travel, as well as mileage. Also, conflict of interest. This means the procedure for handling conflict of interest, and it must address the board as well as the staff of your organization. Next slide, please. Other categories for you to consider and include are financial and accounting written policies. These are to ensure that the grant funds are protected, to ensure that allowability is clearly determined, and to maintain accurate documentation. Personnel is another major category. This ensures proper time and effort reporting for employees as well as volunteers and makes sure that the charges to the grant program are both allowable and consistent. Lastly, one of the most major categories is procurement and purchasing. This means the written policies must address the solicitation of services and goods and avoid any unnecessary purchasing by maintaining a strict allowability of costs. Next slide, please. A very important consideration as you're moving forward with your application is the consideration of debarment and suspension of those involved with grant work. The federal government maintains a list of the debarred, suspended, and excluded parties on its System for Awards Management, or SAM, database. This list is known as the Excluded Parties List, or EPLS. Debarred, suspended, and excluded parties may not be participants or principals in federal assistance awards or subawards. This requirement extends to contracts made under federal awards or subawards as well. We recommend very strongly that you check your own organization and possible contractors before moving forward. You can search these records at the website on this slide in blue print, www.sam.gov. Again, very important to check this before moving forward. Next slide, please. Another important consideration when you are planning your project budget is to keep in mind clearly that all costs, all expenses, and matching contributions must be reasonable, necessary, allowable, and applicable to the grant. As we move forward, keep in mind these four major categories. Next slide, please. For example, compensation for personnel services is allowable if it is reasonable for the services rendered, if it conforms to the established policies of the organization or agency in question, and is consistently applied to both federal and non-federal activities. Also, if it is determined by and supported with documentation as provided by the applicable cost principles. Remember, documentation for these costs must meet the federal standards, which may be different from the timekeeping and activity tracking procedures of your organization. For this point, please jot down and refer to the reference of 2 CFR 200.430. This section will give you clear information. Remember that all subrecipients are required to comply with the applicable federal regulations. These federal regulations specify how to properly implement the grant. Since the grant funds awarded through the Grants Clearinghouse originate from the federal government, all subrecipients are required, just like we are, to comply with the applicable federal regulations. Next slide, please. Most federal programs require that grant funds be provided from two sources. Number one, your project will be funded by federal grant funds, of course, that's what we're talking about today, but also by matching contributions. Both sources are necessary to complete the proposed work and must meet certain requirements to determine that they are allocable to the grant. Most federal government programs also require that the community invest in the project in order to be eligible for the federal grant funds. This particular investment is known as match or cost share, two terms you may have encountered. The amount of match required is specific to each grant program. Remember that matching contributions are cash or in kind in terms of goods or services that come from non-federal sources. The term non-federal is key. Match must not come from federal funds or sources. Next slide, please. Matching contributions must meet all of the following criteria in order to be accepted. They must be verifiable from the recipient's records. They are not included as contributions from any other federally assisted project or program. They must be necessary and reasonable for proper and efficient accomplishment of project or program objectives and allocable under 2 CFR 200. Remember, they must be allowable under applicable cost principles in that 2 CFR 200 document. The references there are provided for you, specifically subpart E. That means 0.402 through 0.411. They must not be paid by the federal government under any other award. Keep these points in mind, and we hope that your planning for the match requirement will be a little bit easier. Next slide, please. Each federal grant has a very specific life cycle. Right now, you can find yourself and your organization at the very top of this schematic drawing. You are in the application phase, but there are several others. The application phase gives way to the pre-award phase, then the award itself, post-award, then monitoring of the project work, and finally, closeout. We'll touch on each one of these categories as we move forward. Next slide, please. The application phase has two parts. First of all, preparation. Prepare not only your application, but also prepare your organization for the grant. Review the grant program requirements, the application process, and also all deadlines. We recommend that you set a schedule for yourself to ensure that you meet these deadlines and assign specific tasks to staff and volunteers. Talk to your executive staff and board, as well as agency partners, about your plans to apply for funding. Also important, as I mentioned before, evaluate your organization's capacity to receive federal grant funds. Ensure that your organization has the legal standing of its own or has a fiscal sponsor that will accept the funds on your behalf. Read those federal grant regulations applicable to your organization to understand all the expectations of grantees. Confirm that your organization has the staffing, infrastructure, and capacity to manage a new grant or several grants, as the case may be. Review your organization's financial and business management systems to make sure that these meet the federal standards. Also, create a very detailed project plan. Develop a work plan with clearly defined tasks. Research budget costs and get preliminary bids if need be. Calculate matching contributions needed to carry out the project, including your own contributions, as well as third-party cooperators. Contact these third parties also to confirm their matching contributions and collect letters of commitment from each if need be. More information for this will follow. Once you've completed all of the necessary preparation, you will submit your grant application along with the accompanying documents. Applications are then reviewed by an independent volunteer review committee, which recommends selected projects for funding. The CFSC Board of Directors then reviews the recommendations and approves the final list of selected projects. At that point, CFSC conducts an organizational capacity risk assessment of the selected applicants as part of the pre-award process. Applicants that successfully complete the pre-award phase and meet the requirements receive final approval for funding and are issued a sub-award agreement. Special conditions may apply to this, so deal with your grants manager or grant specialist with any questions. On this slide, you'll see a couple examples of things that you will need to comply with in terms of making sure that your application package is complete. It includes, once again, the application form, letters of commitment, fiscal sponsor agreement if applicable, maps if need be, and the federal indirect cost rate approval document if that too is necessary. Most importantly of all, we can't emphasize enough, make sure to submit all of these documents and necessary photographs, etc., by the deadline established. Next slide, please. Once you've gone through the phase we just covered in the previous slide, you will encounter the pre-award phase, as I just mentioned. The pre-award phase has two essential parts. The first is project review. There will be an initial screening of your application to determine its eligibility and completeness before it is scored by the review committee. Eligible applications that meet the screening criteria are scored by a panel of volunteers with varied backgrounds who have expertise in reviewing grants and in wildland fire protection issues. The review committee uses the scoring criteria to score these projects, but that's not the only determining factor. Program requirements, budget, the need for a competitive process, and reasonable statewide geographic distribution based on where the applications are submitted are also used in the project selection. The CFSC Board of Directors reviews the recommendations, determines which projects are to be moved on to phase 2, and approves the final list of identified projects. The scoring criteria are included in the appendices of your handbook. Some of the items that will be dealt with include organizational capacity and risk assessment. If your project is preliminarily selected to move on to this phase, you will be contacted by a representative from CFSC. At that time, these applicant organizations and their fiscal sponsors, if applicable, must provide the certain documents and certifications needed to CFSC, as well as undergoing an organizational capacity and risk assessment. We urge you to see the pre-award information section in the handbook for a list of documents that must be submitted as part of the pre-award process. Additional documents or information may be required as per grant requirements. The required documentation and materials must be submitted to CFSC by the given deadline. Remember that failure to respond in a timely manner or failure to submit the documents and certifications by the deadline can result in the grant offer being rescinded. Unfortunately, no extensions of the deadlines can be granted. As the grantor, CFSC must review the risk of each applicant organization or fiscal sponsor prior to awarding a grant to the organization. CFSC staff will conduct one-on-one interviews with each organization or fiscal sponsor to review capacity to manage grants in accordance with all federal grant regulations. The assessment interview will include questions about the organization's financial and accounting systems, purchasing procedures, documentation standards, and other processes that demonstrate whether the organization can successfully manage grant-funded projects. We strongly recommend that applicants and fiscal sponsors collect these documents now to prepare for potential funding. It's also important to check your policies to ensure that they meet the federal standards. Refer to the federal grant regulations and the Office of Management and Budget, as well as Code of Federal Regulations information in the appendices of your handbook. Applicants that receive final approval during the pre-award review process will receive a subaward agreement. This is the legal document binding the applicant, the fiscal sponsor if need be, and CFSC in agreement of the terms of the grant. The subaward agreement states the amount of funding awarded and the match amount committed by your organization. Upon signing the subaward agreement, your organization and fiscal sponsor are legally committed to meet or exceed match projections. The subaward agreement is a legal document. It contains details and references to all of the grant requirements, expectations, terms, and conditions. The subaward agreement must be thoroughly reviewed by all parties participating in the grant and must be signed by a person with decision-making authority within the organization. A sample subaward agreement is also available in the appendices. Remember, the grant is not official until the subaward agreement is signed and returned to CFSC. No grant activities may commence until the signed subaward is received by us and the grant term has begun. Next slide, please. After that particular phase, we reach the post-award phase. And at this moment, we say, congratulations, it's official. You are now a grantee of the California Fire Safe Council, and it's time to get to work. The post-award phase is the place where the grant begins to take off. Again, the success of the grant is based on completing two main goals. project implementation, and proper grant management. Project implementation means that every project funded through CFSC must undergo a review for compliance with federal environmental regulations. The compliance review process for the 2021 grants will be completed by a registered professional forester contracted by CFSC. More information on the environmental compliance process is available in the grant application training section of the appendices. This is very important in that it ensures that federal, state, and local requirements are all met. Also, it will deal with the question of procurement. When selecting contractors and vendors, remember, you must follow your organization's procurement policies and the grant regulations. Be absolutely sure to document the selection process. Also, be sure to check the debarment status of each contractor and its principals, as we've discussed before. Follow your work plan to the letter. You are expected to complete all aspects of the grant project as outlined in the grant application. Remember, your project was funded based on your application, and you agreed to complete those objectives when signing the subaward agreement. Refer to your application throughout project implementation to ensure that you are following the grant work plan and meeting the goals. If you need to make any changes to your original grant project, contact your grant specialist for approval. Remember that your work might include a grant specialist site visit. This is to help document your great work and to demonstrate the work you're doing to the federal government. Next slide, please. Moving into more detail of the post-award phase, keep in mind that proper grant management is just as important as implementing the project itself. Throughout the post-award phase, you will request incremental grant payments from CFSC using the grantee payment request form that you will find in Zoom Grants. You will need to identify the work plan activities that you will pay for with the funds and provide accurate match accounting for each and every request. Requests can be made often and should be for an amount that can be spent immediately on receipt of funds from CFSC. Please underscore this. The CFSC does not have funds on hand to cover your requests. We regularly place consolidated requests for funds based on the payment requests we receive from the individual grantees. Payment to your organization is dependent upon our receipt of those funds from the federal awarding agency. Quarterly reporting is also a requirement of the grant. You will report on the progress of your grant, comparing your actual accomplishments to your projections. You will provide a narrative, a description, in other words, of the project, noting successes, setbacks, and any changes approved by your grant specialist. You will also report on the project budget, providing a complete accounting of all expenditures of grant funds, as well as matching contributions. You are expected to expend matching contributions regularly throughout the grant. All data, and this is a very important point, must be true and accurate. CFSC uses your data to compile periodic reports to the federal funding agency. Be absolutely sure to check, then double check your accounting. The reporting schedule will be in your subaward agreement. Basically, as you can see on this slide, we recommend that you document, and make sure that your grant file is organized and up to date. In terms of being up to date, remember that the insurance, the cage number, and the SAM registration must also be renewed annually. Next slide, please. Now we're getting into the closeout phase. It begins immediately following the grant term. All grants must be properly closed out with CFSC in accordance with grant requirements. The closeout process includes the following: a final progress report that is due 30 days following the grant end date, a mandatory grant closeout report, and an optional confidential questionnaire. It includes photos from your photo monitoring work, one original and 1 copy of each education and outreach product that you've produced for your work. Any unused surplus funds must be returned to CFSC, as well as any interest in excess of $500. Again, that must be returned to the granting agency. The final progress report is due 30 days after the end of the grant term. The closeout report and supplemental information are due 90 days after the end of the grant term. All grant files should be properly restored until 3 years after the close of CFSC's master grant with the federal funding agency. This may be several years past the date your grant ended. Therefore, keep in mind, the CFSC will notify you when you can dispose of your grant files. You are responsible to provide safe and secure storage for these grant files, such as in a fire safe or other container to protect them from fire, water, pests, and any other threats that you might encounter. If there is a change in the contact person for the grant, please notify CFSC immediately so that we are kept well aware. Next slide, please. With the current economic climate and the limited resources for funding, it should come as no surprise that everyone from congressional representatives to average taxpayers are being called upon for increased accountability and transparency when it comes to government spending. In the world of federal grants, this means that grantees and subrecipients are under increased scrutiny to show that the funds are being used appropriately and properly for a public purpose and in compliance with federal grant regulations. Remember, when you sign a subaward agreement for a federal grant, you are entering into a legally binding agreement with the awarding agency and the federal government. As a grantee, you have a legal responsibility to ensure that the federal grant funds are used properly and are therefore subject to penalties if you do not comply with those regulations. While most grantees would state that they would never knowingly commit grant fraud, it's important to understand that many various ways might occur in which an organization may engage in activities that could be considered fraudulent. The federal offices of the Inspector General conducts audits of grantees and grant processes, as well as investigations related specifically to fraud and other inappropriate use of federal funds. Some examples of this include conflict of interest. These are transactions involving undisclosed related parties, purchasing goods or services from a business in which the organization has an ownership interest, or any other kind of contact. It also can include making materially false statements to the government. These can include misstatements, false certifications, failure to maintain adequate supporting documentation, misrepresentation of costs, and an attempt to charge unallowable costs. Also, grant fraud may include outright theft. This includes fictitious transactions, creative bookkeeping, the misuse of a credit card designated for grant-funded purchases, or any other activity that diverts legitimate grant funds to legitimate purposes into anything that the federal government would not approve of. Grantees must do everything they can to prevent grant fraud from taking place. Many organizations will need to review their business policies and procedures to ensure that there are proper internal controls to protect against grant fraud. Avoiding grant fraud is just another reason why it's of paramount importance that potential grantees understand and prepare their organizations now in advance to ensure that they are ready and able to comply with all of the requirements associated with receiving federal grant funds. Next slide, please. There are penalties for fraud, theft, or anything related to misuse of federal grant funds. These can include repayment of grant funds to the awarding agency, criminal prosecution and civil fraud remedies. It can also include being suspended, debarred, or it can include the cancellation of current or future grant awards. You may have experienced less monitoring under a previous grant, but the requirements have been in place for federal grants for many years. If you have received grants from CFSC in previous grant cycles, then you've been required to comply with federal grant regulations in the past as declared in your subaward agreement, and hopefully have a familiarity with those policies. As you prepare an application for CFSC's Grants Clearinghouse, consider the requirements of the grant and the workload associated with meeting those requirements and deadlines. Design your project and budget to accommodate the documentation and accounting processes that will be required. Make sure that you and your organization are prepared to take on the responsibility of managing a project in this way. Grantees are closely monitored during the grant term through quarterly reports, site visits, and desk reviews of grant documents. If a grantee is found to be in non-compliance or fails to meet certain requirements, then CFSC may withhold pending and future grant payments and or terminate your grant based on failure to meet grant requirements or non-performance. Remember, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Next slide, please. Please keep in mind, there are many rules and regulations that govern the use of federal grant funds. Your agency will have to abide by all of the applicable federal grant regulations in your agency if they accept the funds. It's your agency's responsibility to review and abide by all of the regulations governing the grant. At this point, I will open it up for questions. I believe, Becca, we have approximately 10 minutes, is that correct, for questions? And then we will go into a short break for everyone. So if there are any questions, now is the time to raise them to be answered by myself or any of my colleagues who are here present to chime in and add good information.
Absolutely. And you can ask questions in two different ways. In the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom page, on the bottom right is a reactions. And then the bottom of that, there's a raise hand function. So you can raise your hand and we can ask you to unmute, or you can type your questions into the chat. So we'll just give anyone a moment if anyone has any questions. Okay, we did have one question in the chat of, will help in getting a fiscal sponsor be getting addressed? So we don't cover in this presentations how to find a fiscal sponsor, more of just the roles and responsibilities of a fiscal sponsor. But that is something that we can discuss one-on-one. So if you'd like to send me an email, we could follow up on that as well. And then will the slides be available to download? I hadn't planned on it, but we definitely can make that an option. So when we send out the recording and frequently asked questions, I'll also be sure to include the slides for folks.
Hi, Becca, it's Lauren. I've been trying to answer folks' questions in the chat. So I wanted to clarify something regarding fiscal sponsors, just to make sure you understand. A fiscal sponsor is not absolutely required for every organization. It's just for an organization that's either not incorporated, doesn't have legal standing, or an organization that's maybe not sure they're comfortable with the added workload of managing a grant, and they want to work with a partner organization to receive the grant funds for them. So I just want to make sure that was clear. And there was another question in chat about capacity building. That's probably a good thing to discuss if you're looking at capacity building activities with a grant application. You can talk to one of us, either Dan Lang or myself, or also Mela Arthur is a good person to talk about. We have capacity building programs aside from the 21 SFA program that also support that type of activity. So you may have multiple options in terms of what you're wanting to do. So.
Thank you, Lauren. Mala, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that for the capacity building questions?
Not exactly, but just to make one thing clear, if you have let's say an Edison grant or a CAL FIRE grant, since neither of those are federally funded, if the activities that they are supporting are approved by the SFA grant, you can use those as matching. So I think that's one easy way to do capacity building with another grant from another source that is not federal. So that we have other ideas too. So Elaine, if you want to get together, later this week or something, I'm happy to do that. Just give me a call or an email. We'll set something up.
Thank you, Mala. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions or any raised hands. So let's go ahead and take a break. It is 11:02 at the moment, so why don't we all come back right at 11:10. Give everyone, and now it's 11:03, so you throw in a quick 7-minute break real quick, and we will start right back up at noon. Or no, sorry, oh my gosh, 11:10. Goodness gracious. Thank you all. All right, Ellie, can we get to the next slide, please? Okay, hopefully everyone had a nice break and we're able to return on time. As Thomas said earlier, my name is Becca Joyner. I am a staff grant specialist with CFFC as well. And I will be presenting on how to write the application. So if we can go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so there are a few things that we're going to cover in this portion of the presentation. And hopefully this last bit should get us right till noon. So again, if you have any questions, highly encourage you to put them into that chat so we can answer them as we go. So what we'll be covering this afternoon, we'll be talking about Zoom grants and just an introduction to that system. That's where we use for our application process, but as well as our grants management system. We'll talk about how to complete your application using Zoom grants, as well as best practices, next steps, and resources. So first off, you're gonna need to create your Zoom grants account. So next slide, please. And you're going to be following that link that Nina had provided earlier, that Zoom grants through CFFC, and you're going to have to go to that page first. So you're going to log on to our CFFC website, and there is where you're going to be able to create your account. After you've created your account and have selected the application you would like to be applying for, you will then be able to go directly to www.zoomgrants.com and log in from there as well. And this is what that page looks like. So if you go there and you're already an applicant, you can directly log in at the top, or down below, you can set up a new account. If you have any issues, please contact Zoom Grants technical support team. They're available from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Mountain Time, Monday through Friday, and you can call them toll free at 866-323-5404, and we'll drop that number in the chat for you as well. All right, next slide, please. So once you're in your Zoom Grants account, you're going to have two views available, your account profile and your application. Please make sure to complete your account profile before working on any application. To start an application, you're going to select the Open Programs tab, and you will see the 2021 Grants Clearinghouse SFA as an option. So you're going to select that hyperlink text to start a new application. So next slide, please. This is kind of what it looks like. So you'll see there when you're in there, you have that My Account Home up in the upper left-hand corner. You'll also have a notification that's like, you've started your application. And then down underneath that, you have your incomplete applications. And I actually did a test one yesterday where I grabbed a snapshot from. So you can see there that I have an incomplete application that I can click on for the 2021 SFA program. And from there, you're going to click the Apply button to start your application. Next slide, please. Once you're in the grant program, you'll see that there's two different sections that have tabs. The first section is right underneath that 21 USFS SFA Grant Program. There are a few tabs that are there that you can see. There's View Open Programs, Show Description, so the description of the grant, additional online resources that are available for this application, restrictions, library, or contact admin if you need to get a hold of our clearinghouse administrator, Amber Gardner. And then underneath there where you have that little green arrow is the grant application tabs. And those are the 5 tabs that we will be going through for the rest of this presentation, talking about what they are and what needs to go in each of those tabs. And then 3, you'll start a new application. So you will not be allowed to enter any information on the application form until you select the Apply Now / Start an Application. You can view the entire application and instructions, but you cannot complete the questions until you've selected that button. Next slide, please. So kind of furthering that snapshot that you saw from those 5 tabs, there's the first one, which is the application snapshot. This is where you'll put in the project name, the amount that you're requesting for the grant, the organizational contact information, and then on tab 2 is where you'll provide your organization information as well as that capacity information that Thomas discussed. And then there's tab 3, and that's where we'll spend a lot of our time today as well. This is where you're really going to be discussing what are your projects, what's the need for your project, who's your project affecting, and what's the type. And then we'll be moving to tab 4. This is where you'll be providing your work plan and then the federal and match deliverables, as well as your detailed budget and match that will be provided by each of the organizations providing match to this application. And then last but not least, then we will go through tab 5, which is your documents tab. So this is where folks can upload their letters of commitment cover letter, as well as their, if applicable, fiscal sponsor agreement, as well as an indirect cost rate agreement, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So information entered to your application is saved automatically as you go through the application. And what will happen is you'll have, I couldn't get a screenshot of it, but it's this little box that says saving. It pops up on your screen when you click out of a text box. And once that disappears, then you know that that section is saved. So just ensure that as you're going along that it is saving with you. And please note that all 5 parts must be completed in order to submit your application. So let's jump right in, all right? Tab 1, next slide, please. Application contacts. The application organization must identify 2 contacts on the application. The applicant contact should be the person who will manage the project from planning to implementation and reporting. And then the organization official contact must be a person who is authorized to make official decisions and act as a signatory for the organization, such as a board president, executive director, fire chief, senior staff, etc. If you've applied to the Grants Clearinghouse before, this information will automatically be filled out. And if you change it, it will change for all past applications as well. So please make sure that this is accurate and up to date. And for the applicant and fiscal sponsor information, please be sure to use the exact organization name as it appears on all official documents, registrations, including insurance, bank accounts, SAM, and DUNS, as well as using the official mailing address. So that way, if we ever need to contact you, we have the appropriate address. And Thomas talked about this a little bit earlier, but each applicant or fiscal sponsor must have a DUNS number and cage code to receive funding through the Grants Clearinghouse. There is no charge for either of these items. In this section, enter the cage code for the applicant and or fiscal sponsor. If the organization does not have a cage code, please go to that website we referenced earlier. We could drop it in again, which is www.sam.gov to register and receive one. And please make sure that you're on the actual site. If you just Google SAM, other sites may pop up that want you to register you for a fee. So make sure you're at that appropriate .gov website. Also, please note that your SAM account must be renewed annually to remain active. So be sure to allow time to register or renew before the expiration date, as the process can take some time. And if you need more information on DUNS and CAGE, you can reference the application handbook as well. Next slide, please. So each organization account is owned, accessed, and managed by a single set of login credentials. So one email address and one password. If you have multiple people who need to have full access to the applications in your account, we recommend setting the email address associated with the account to either be the person who will be the primarily responsible contact for managing your organization's applications, or a general email address that can send emails to multiple folks within your organization. In either case, you can share your login credentials with any other person and they can log into the account at any time. Also, additional users can be added to individual applications within the account. So if you have a colleague who just needs to have access to one application and someone else who is in charge of submitting the invoices for all of your approved applications, the account owner can give them access to those individuals by adding them as collaborators on the appropriate applications. If you have certain people who should receive email notifications pertaining to a specific application, you can add them as additional contacts on the application. If the account owner leaves your organization, please make sure to have them share their latest account credentials before they leave so you can still access the account. If they've already left and maybe you've applied to a grant before and you don't have access, please reach out and submit a support request so that way we can get that account information transferred over. Next slide. All right. That was easy. We finished one tab already. So now we're getting into tab 2. And this is the organizational capacity tab. So this is where you're going to discuss what organizational capacity your organization has. We'd like to see that multiple people are involved, what their roles and responsibilities are going to be, and the processes for separation of duties. We also like for you to share a history and accomplishments so that way we know that you have that ability to complete target objectives and as well as to manage the project from start to finish. So if you've received a grant through the clearinghouse or other federal funds, please describe 2 major accomplishments that you had from those grants or opportunities. If you've received non-federal donation grants or membership fees, please indicate 2 major accomplishments completed with those funds. And if you don't have an example of either of those, explain that and answer the accomplishments you do have. We only need 2 of each accomplishment in your answer, so just describe the 2 that are most applicable. And then for fiscal sponsors as well, they play a variety of roles in the organization they sponsor. And so they are legally responsible for the grant funds. Fiscal sponsors may also provide staffing, accounting services, project management, and leadership. These services may be provided free of charge for the applicant organization or for a fee, which may be included in the grant budget. The cost should be clearly stated in the budget and the fiscal sponsor agreement, which is required as part of the application. If you're considering being a fiscal sponsor for an applicant, be sure to review the fiscal sponsor criteria in the handbook. Next slide, please. And like that, we're done with tab 2. So now let's sit in tab 3 for a minute and discuss the project information. So you are going to provide a project narrative. Please be sure to stay focused on what each question is asking, and please try not to be repetitive, as well as not using any local acronyms in the project description. And the first thing you'll be doing is identifying the problem. And you don't need to go into a lengthy explanation about basic fire science or speaking generally about the larger wildfire problems. The reviewers that we'll have for these grant applications are very familiar with this information. So please instead stick close to home and let us know what makes your community particularly at risk for wildfire. Provide the name of the county, cities, and communities that are in the planning area, and describe how wildfire affects that area. Please provide information on previous or current fires. And then also explain the specific risks and hazards facing your community. Then you'll be describing the purpose and need for this specific project. Explain why and how the project will address the problems as stated above. Be specific and clear in your description, who will be involved in the planning as well as the implementation, and then describe the direct benefit of the project. Explain how this project will help the communities that you serve, which we'll go into a little bit more on the next slide. So it is becoming increasingly important to engage the public in our projects. CFFC and USFS, the United States Forest Service, and the application reviewers will want to make sure that the grant project has a lasting impact on the community. Sustainability is vital as taxpayers and funders want to make sure that the dollars are going to worthwhile projects that will continue to have an impact after the grant term ends. So also please describe what outreach efforts will be included in this project by describing what educational activities or materials this project will utilize to engage community members, as well as elected officials or fire jurisdictions in your area. Explain how your project will be advertised and publicized to give the community a chance to become engaged, and some examples of outreach efforts that may be going on that are planned. Then you'll also describe the community investment. So you'll be talking about how this project will have a lasting impact on the community, how this project will lead the community in investing and making itself fire safe after the grant term ends, as well as the type of community capacity that will be developed to sustain the project in the long term. So how would you describe the future impact of your project? Will you implement an ongoing community awareness program? What's going to be going on there? So make sure you're explaining that as well. And then lastly, you'll be describing what the maintaining effectiveness of vegetation treatment of the project will be. So if you have a hazardous fuel reduction project, how will the site be maintained to prevent regrowth of hazardous fuels when the grant funded portion of the project is complete? Next slide, please. Okay, so then you'll be discussing more community impacts, and one of those is talking about the communities that are affected. And we asked this question in a few different ways on the application. So there's one, the communities at risk designation, which is a specific official designation by CAL FIRE. So although you may consider your project area to be at risk, you may not include them in this section of the application unless they are on the official CAR list, which we will provide a link in the chat for that. If your community is not on that list, then you will provide them under the other communities affected section of the application. You'll also note whether or not you are part of a FireWise community, or if your project area will be serving any FireWise communities. And if you are unsure, we can provide those links in the chat as well as just information on becoming a designated FireWise community that can be found at their general website at www.firewise.org. So you're going to be listing the communities that are impacted by your project's deliverables for any of the types of projects, whether it be for prevention and education programs, hazardous fuel reduction, as well as that planning, so fire management plans, risk assessments, or equivalents. You'll also be letting us know what political boundaries are within your application. So what are the congressional districts, senates, state assembly, and the county your project is located within, as well as the federal land adjacency, if applicable. And then lastly, what staffing will this project provide? So are you going to have employees? How many? Are you going to be bringing on contractors? What is the impact on the community going to be that way as well? Next slide, please. In these next few slides, there are a few things that we'll have to tie or connect your application to. And one of those things is the cohesive strategy. So the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy is one of those things that you'll need to tie your application to. And if you would like more information on the cohesive strategy, so if you can see if your project is connected with that, we will provide a link for that as well. But you're going to be doing connecting it in 3 ways. So is it restoring and maintaining resilient landscapes, that fire adapted community development, as well as wildfire response? On the next slide, There is another thing that we'll need to tie our applications to, which is the California Forest Action Plan, which also has those, how are you going to connect your project to this? Is your project within a priority landscape? If you don't know that, we have a link for that as well, where you can review those strategies. But you're going to indicate how your project will link to the California Forest Action Plan's 3 main themes, which are conservation, protection, and enhancing. All right, next slide. And then building a fire adapted community. So how is your project building a fire adapted community? And as you can see here, there are so many different ways that folks can work together to create a fire adapted community. And by doing so many of these, it automatically can tie to the cohesive strategy, especially since we're all working together in creating that fire adapted community. But if you would like more information on fire adapted communities, you could visit their website at www.fireadapted.org. And then we just want to know that your project is being developed in cooperation with your federal, state, and local fire agencies to gain their support as well. So that way it's a holistic approach for a project. All right, we're still on tab 3. So let's go ahead and move along. You'll also need to provide the location and condition of the project area. So you're going to need to provide the latitude and longitude of your project, which can be found by using a GPS or using an online mapping tool such as Google Maps, usgs.gov, or itouchmap.com. For planning and outreach projects, please locate the community in which you will be working and display the latitude and longitude coordinates above the marker that best represents the community. For field treatment projects, zoom to the project location center and use the coordinates for that location. And then you'll also need to provide the fire hazard severity zone as well, which if you would like more information on that, state and county fire hazard severity zone maps can be found at the link that we will drop in the chat. So sorry, Nina, I am making her work so hard on dropping all of these links. So big round of applause to her. It's much appreciated. You could also find more information on fire hazard severity zones at www.fire.ca.gov. All righty. Next slide. So for each of your projects, you will need to provide a vicinity map. So where is the project taking place? And it is required for all projects. So for projects with disturbed locations, such as a homeowner chipping program or a regional focus, such as those that are just planning or education, a map that identifies the region of the activities is adequate. For vegetation treatment projects with specific locations such as fuel breaks, the map can either show a pinpoint or a boundary of the treatment area and must contain enough specific information that a grant reviewer can locate where the project is taking place. A simple map can be made by copying an existing map in the area, as you can see on the slide that is provided. And you can just draw an X on the project location by circling the project areas. So as you can see here on this slide, you're able to see where the project is taking place, and then specifically where their chipping and defensible treatments are also taking place. And then just please note that additional detailed maps will be required for selected applicants during the pre-award phase. So, then we'll get into talking about fuels treatment and project information. So if you're having fuels treatment, you will need to describe the vegetation type and the treatment site. You'll also need to describe the planned vegetation treatment in detail. What is the pre and post treatment site plan? And if the project will biomass, what is the type of that biomass, the quantity, and how it will be used? Next slide, please. You'll also need to provide the number of fuels treatment projects that will be completed through the grant. So you're going to be counting by unique project, describing the method used to calculate that number, and the total acreage of that project area. So I'm going to give a few examples, and I hope I won't be confusing in it. But so like, let's say you're going to have 2 different fuel breaks in 2 different locations, and that's what you're proposing in this project. Then the number of the projects for that proposal would be 2, because there are 2 separate fuel breaks. If you're providing a chipping program in one community with 150 homes, then the number of projects for that would be 1, because it's 1 chipping program for a specific community. But if the application is county-wide or regional, and it's, you know, again, a chipping program, then you may count the individual communities that you'll be serving as unique projects, or you may decide to count it only as 1 for the project for just chipping. So make sure that you're describing that in your application of this is how many projects we hope to do, and then the communities that they'll be serving. So one of the things that Thomas mentioned earlier is environmental compliance. And we wanted to make sure that we just let you be aware of what that environmental compliance is for all of our projects that will be reviewed for compliance with the following federal environmental regulations and other laws that may apply specifically for California. So please take a look at these and try, if you're able to tie them to your project, that is great if you're already aware. Or on the next slide, you can consult with a registered professional forester, and they can help with conducting environmental surveys, defining the most effective treatment prescription, completing timber harvest plan exemption documents, and then addressing potential pest issues as well. This will be a portion of our pre-award phase as well. All selected applicants will need to go through an environmental compliance process in which we, the California Fire Safe Council, will provide your documentations to a consultant that we work with that will provide environmental compliance sign off for each of the grants. But just wanted to make sure that you knew as well, this is an option if it's something that you would like to look for either just through your project or with your application. And then on the next slide, again, very similar to the last few slides, is that your project area may include species, habitats, cultural resources, or historical sites that require special protection. So please be aware of that. And record searches or surveys may be required prior to the project implementation. And if that's the case, like Tom said earlier, no groundbreaking projects can start until your environmental sign-off compliance is signed off anyways. So just as an FYI, even if you are selected, that will be a part of our process as well. All right. We finished with tab 3, woohoo, which is the real bulk of what your application would be. But then on tab 4 is your tables. And this is where you're going to provide what your work plan is. So what are the tasks that are happening, the activities that will be taking place, as well as the time frame in months. So when will they be happening to complete the project? Who is responsible for completing those activities, as well as the expected outcome, result, and deliverable. Next slide. So how to report these deliverables. You're going to enter the project quantity associated with the cost only once, and you're going to be providing, actually, it's once per thing. So you're going to enter it for federal on the federal grant side. So what are your deliverables for the federal funds, and what are your deliverables for your match funds, as well as the associated cost with each of them. And please note, please only enter whole numbers. No decimals or cents will be allowed. And so for a few examples of that, if you're planning on conducting 3 community risk assessments, that'll cost $3,000 total to complete. And the the federal portion of the grant will cover 2,000 of that, and in-kind will cover the rest. So you would say, okay, that means that 2 of our deliverables are going to be on the federal side with $2,000, and then 1 deliverable on the match side with $1,000 covering that, for a total of 3 community risk assessments and a total cost of $3,000. And we'll show you what that looks like in a few slides, but just kind of an example to get you used to what it'll look like. Oh, thank you so much. You'll also be providing deliverables on whether a community assessment or wildfire planning project as well. So are you conducting community risk assessments? How many would you be planning in this project, and for how many communities? Are you conducting a community wildfire protection plans? These grants always make me laugh when I open their tables, because I'm like, where are their deliverables? And I'm like, oh, it's only 1, because they're hoping to do a CWPP throughout their term, as well as a fire management plan. And then you'll also be providing what your deliverables are for education and outreach. So projects such as workshops, pamphlets, posters, billboards, and videos, count each of these as a unique product as a quantity of 1. So if you're going to be making pamphlets, and that's 1 pamphlet that you're going to be making. If you're planning on making 500 copies, the target would still be 1, because you're designing and creating that 1 pamphlet. However, if you're then going to be taking that 1 pamphlet, and we want to conduct, 20 different workshops with it, make sure that you're having, these is how many programs we're going to have it. If it's just 1 program, then that'll also just be 1. So just making sure that you're cataloging what your deliverables are and how many programs you will be providing, as well as products associated with those programs. And then on the next slide, you'll also be discussing what hazardous fuel treatment you'll be providing as well. So there are 3 different areas that you can report on that. So there's that preparation. What prep is going to be going into prepping this area, and how many acres are going to be treated for preparation for treatment, as well as then there are a few different ways that you can report the mechanical treatment, as well as prescribed fire treatment. And there's also another section for other. And so for this section, make sure that you're being clear in getting the total acres, because if you're treating just one set, a set of property, so let's say it's just 10 acres, and you're gonna prep that area, as well as do some mechanical treatment, and maybe another treatment as well. So we're going to prep, we're going to mechanically treat, and then we're also going to graze there, just for good measure. Let's get all 3 in. So let's say it's just on those 10 acres. When you're doing your deliverables, you need to make sure that you're having that 10 acres each time. So we're going to prep for 10 acres, 10, and then our mechanical treatment, 10, and then other treatment, we're also going to have 10 acres. So the total deliverables for your hazardous fuel treatment would end up being 30 for that 30 acres, even though you're only treating 10 acres over the full project. So just making sure that you're reporting each of the activities. And actually on the next slide, it may make it a little bit easier for you to see all of them that are there. And so it's a little small, but like I said, the first column here, this is saying what's the federal associated deliverable, and then the federal cost that's associated with that. So if we're going back to that community risk assessment example, we said that we were doing a total of 3. So in this first one, it would be 2, because we're only going to be having $2,000 of our federal costs go to that community risk assessment. And then for the match quantity, it would be 1, with a match cost projected as well of $1,000. So as you would see that first example, when you went in, that's how we would fill it out in our application. As well as the information and education materials, same thing. So how many materials will we be creating or programs, and then the associated cost. both on the federal and match side, or either or. And then same thing for fields treatment and making sure that we're reporting our acres in each of the areas that we will be treating those acres, as well as the cost associated with that. So hopefully that made sense for you all on that one. And we will go ahead and jump into the budget detail on the next slide. So you will then also be providing a budget. All grant expenses and match must be allowable under the federal grant regulations and adequately documented. A sample budget is provided in the sample application in the appendices. In the budget detail, you must provide specific details about each cost, including a breakdown and unit cost whenever possible. The federal funders require this level of detail in the application budget and when reporting on the cost if the project is funded. So here are those areas that you'll see, those cost categories that you'll be providing in your application. So you'll be providing what is the personnel cost. This is for actual employees of the applicant organization. And if the application or organization does not have employees and uses independent contractors or volunteers, then you would not use this category. You would use contractual. And then you'll also be providing fringe benefit details, as well as if your project is going to require travel. And enter the cost associated with the travel that is necessary to complete the grant, which can include lodging, transportation, mileage, and food. And then as well as equipment. Equipment is defined as a tangible item with a unit cost of $5,000 or more and a lifespan of more than 1 year. Anything else that you would think of as equipment, like chainsaws, parts, or computers that have a unit cost under $5,000 should be itemized in the supplies category. Prior to submitting the grant application, the applicant must submit a cost benefit analysis via email to a CFFC grant specialist that's assigned to your area. You can see that on our website. And the cost benefit analysis must include comparison of purchasing the equipment versus borrowing from another federal program or renting it. Vehicle purchases are not allowed. And when you use equipment as match, you can charge a use allowance, which is similar to rent, or you can count the depreciation that occurs during the time the equipment is used for the grant project. This value or cost would go under the contractual category. And then there are the other categories such as supplies, contractual, other, and indirect costs. And we'll actually go through indirect costs on the next slide. So if your organization has a federally approved indirect cost rate, this rate may be included as a federal cost in your grant application budget. If you have an approved rate but do not intend to charge it to the rate as federal cost to your grant, you may use that rate as match as well. All righty, next slide. All right, we talked a little bit about matching contributions earlier, but we'll go through that again. So again, what is a matching item? This could be cash or in kind. It could be directly from the applicant organization, or it can be a third-party organization as well. It must be listed in the budget, as well as having a letter of commitment, which we'll get to in a moment. And it must conform to the grant rules and OMB guidelines. It must be allowable and relevant to the grant-funded project. It must be verifiable, so there must be documentation that will be provided and will be required. And it cannot be counted as match for another federal grant, nor can it be sourced from another federal grant or source. So what this will look like in Zoom grants. So you have your a list here that you'll be providing match amount by all organizations. So if your organization it's just us, we're going to be doing it, you would have that one line, or if it's going to be multiple cost categories, what's the organization, what's the cost category, What is the type of match? So maybe you have cash and in kind, as well as the amount. And then each of these will also have to have that letter of commitment as well that is provided in the next tab, which is actually also the next slide, documents. And the document tab in Zoom Grants is where you're going to be uploading documents into your application. You're going to choose the upload button and you're going to navigate to the file on your computer. So please don't put in links, actually have it be an attached document. So this is where you're going to need to upload a few of these things. And I know the vicinity maps is if applicable, that's all projects. I want a map for all projects, that letter of commitment for each of your match sources, as well as a commitment cover letter. And if you have a fiscal sponsor, we'll need that fiscal sponsor agreement, as well as just previously discussed that indirect cost rate agreement as well, if it applies. And you're going to upload the documents into Zoom Grants. Again, use the file option only, and please do not use an external link or location. And I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. All right, next tab. I saw a question in the chat, which I know Laurent already quickly got to, but can volunteer time be used as a part of the match? Absolutely, absolutely. Just make sure that you have documentation for those volunteer hours that will be provided. That's how a lot of our grants count their matches, through their volunteer time. Okay, so fiscal sponsor agreements. So for those of you that are using a fiscal sponsor, there must be a fiscal sponsor agreement that must be signed and submitted with your application. And what needs to be included in that agreement is we need to know what the fiscal sponsor's responsibility is in regards to managing the grant funds, as well as communication between the fiscal sponsor and the applicant. What is the process for reimbursement or payment of grant expenses? What will the role of each of the organizations be in regards to managing the project? How will grant documentation be collected and stored? And who will complete grant-related reports? And you should be able to find a sample fiscal sponsor agreement in the handbook as well. All right. This we talked about a little bit, but you will, for those match sources, need to provide our contributions listed in your application, and also have a letter of commitment. And again, for each of those contributions, a letter of commitment will be required. So it must be uploaded with your application, and it also must be on an organizational letterhead or in an email that has organizational identification, such as a logo included. And those letters of commitment must include a description and dollar value of the match provided and how it relates to the project, the contributor contact information, the timing of match provided, the type of match, so it'll be cash or in kind, and a signature of an appropriate organization representative. Some more information on letters of commitment. Again, that description, that it's a statement of commitment, not support. So we are committing these funds to this grant application, as well as a way to contact the contributor, what's their information, and then a signature of an appropriate organization representative. Sorry, these two slides are a little repetitive, but same information. Next slide. All right, so this is what that looks like when you're uploading it into Zoom Grants. So you'll press that file upload and another window will pop up. From there, you will, if you can see that one on the right-hand side, there's a little one, it says file description. So you can put, letter of commitment, name of organization. And then there's that file upload. And right underneath that, there's that browse. So that's where you'll hit browse. You'll find the document on your computer and you'll upload it. And then down at the bottom, there's that upload now. Once you click that button, it will refresh on your page, and then up in the top left-hand corner of this window, it should say file uploaded successfully. And then that's when you're like, okay, great, I can just exit out of this because you know your document uploaded. Or you can upload additional letters of commitment or other needed documents at that time. Next slide. All right, so from there, you're going to submit and check for errors. So when every tab is complete, and I know it sounds crazy, but you're going to hit the submit now button. And what will happen is the system will perform an error check, and the list of questions that are incomplete or have errors will pop up in red. And then if you scroll down past the questions, you can select each of them to correct them. And then once you have fixed all of the errors, click the refresh page at the bottom, and the system will recheck all of your answers again. So next tab. So after that, you'll be able to start submitting your application. And so you refreshed your screen, and this is what this is an older version, but what will happen is a new box will pop up for submit now, that'll pop up there, and you'll be prompted to enter your initials, and then you can submit. And so by entering your initials, please note that you certify that this application truthfully and accurately represents your request and is hereby submitted for review. Submission of this application does not in any way guarantee that you will receive funding. Submission of this application also indicates your agreement to the terms of using Zoom grants. Once you hit submit, you have successfully completed your application. You will receive a confirmation message in Zoom grants as well. There will be a timestamp of the date and time the application was submitted where the submit now button was located. You can also view previously submitted applications. So if you have an application that's in progress, select the incomplete tab to continue your work so you can come and go, work on it in increments. Your incomplete applications will be shown by application ID number until they are given a name. If you have submitted one and want to review it, select the submitted tab, and there you can see your previous applications. And then on the account homepage, you have the option to print or archive applications as well. All right, next slide, please. Things that you can do to submit successfully. Determine what you need to do and make a schedule. Make sure that your cooperators understand their roles, that you have identified your letters of commitment and who your match sources will be. Check to see if the application responses are consistent. Ask others to proofread your application and evaluate your application based on the scoring criteria. And then make sure the application is complete and submitted on time. And again, that's due on June 15th at 11:59 p.m. at the latest. And then if we can actually skip 2 slides, Ellie, straight to phase 1. Thank you. Okay. So in this one, we're just kind of wrapping up where we are. So we are currently in phase 1. And so once your application is submitted, we will go into application review, which will include an initial screening. And that includes, was the application submitted on time and is it complete? Is the organization eligible? Did they submit the only 1 or 2 applications? Is the grant amount requested allowable and doesn't exceed the maximum? Do we have all of our letters of commitment and our cover letter, as well as our match and letters of commitment being consistent? If you need a fiscal sponsor or have one, that letter is also there, as well as that agreement. And then if you were going to propose purchasing equipment, that we have that analysis that was sent to a CFFC grant specialist, as well as the fact that the budgeted costs are allowable in consistent with 2 CFR 200 and with the funding requested amount. And then finally, that the deliverable costs are consistent with the budget totals. And then from there, it will go to our review committee. So applications that pass the initial screening will be reviewed and scored by the volunteer grant review committee. And then during this review process, the grant review committee using the scoring criteria to score the projects, but is not the only determining factor. There's also program requirements, budget, the need for a competitive process, and reasonable statewide geographic distribution are also used in the project selection process. The CFFC Board of Directors reviews the recommendations and determines which projects are to be moved into phase 2 and approves the final list of identified projects. So going into phase 2. Going into phase 2 means we're going into that pre-award phase. So that organizational capacity and risk assessment. So if selected, one would need to complete a pre-award report. They may also be asked to submit required organizational documents, as well as self-certifying that the organization has those written policies and procedures as previously discussed in this presentation. And as well as needing to sign and submit required certifications and assurances, and undergo an interview with CFFC on organizational capacity. Next slide. So just a visual representation again. So we are currently in the application phase, which includes phase 1. And then if selected, folks will go into phase 2, which is as part of the pre-award phase. And if those that selected also complete that process and are approved, they will then go to the award phase. Next slide. All right, some important dates. I know you've already seen this one before. For questions for when would phase 2 occur? That would be in August. So after applications have been reviewed, so it would be after August once the board has ratified those decisions. And let me see, just a reminder, applications are due on June 15th at the latest of 11:59 p.m. that night. So, and then announcements for if you've been selected into phase 2 will be in August of 2021. So can we go to the next slide, please? Again, I know we've given you these links a few times, but if you have any questions or need any of these resources, you can go to our website, as well as the login page for creating a Zoom Grants account, and then the Zoom Grants link as well. So we are right at 12:02. So I'll quickly ask Nina if there are any open questions that were not answered in the chat. And then if anyone else has any additional questions, again, if you can, in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, there's that reactions and then raise hand function. Okay, quick question. Let's check in on that, Jason. I
was going to see if I could help jump into.
Yeah.
So if you own the land and you're a non-federal entity, it should be allowable, but we'd want to talk about the specifics. We do from time to time get applications from the state recreation area near Auburn, which is actually owned by the BOR. So it's a little bit confusing what's federal and what's state. So yeah, it would require a little bit of specific discussion about the individual situation you're in.
Thank you, Lauren. All right, any other questions? Is everyone just eager to get to lunch? All right, if there are no other questions, huge thank you for everyone for attending today. And if you have any questions that pop up after today's presentation, again, you can feel free to reach out to any of the CFF staff here that are on the call. You can just wildly pick an email and send it to one of us. It'll get to the right person, which you can find our contact information on the 21 SFA grant announcement page on our website. And other than that, thank you so much for attending, and we appreciate your time.